Jerry Claiborne is the only new coach we've greeted on the Skyriders tour this year. You'll recall the turbulence of recent years here at Kentucky, the firing of Coach Fran Kersey and the hiring of Jerry Claiborne away from Maryland. Normally in a case such as this, the new man finds new players, and the Kentucky situation looks very normal. With a tough schedule which includes Oklahoma, Clemson, Auburn, Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee, the immediate future is bleak. Probably what Claiborne is most interested in this year is establishing credibility. He very much wants to show the Kentucky fans that his players are good citizens. There have been far too many scrapes with the law here in recent years. Claiborne is a hometown boy. He played and coached under Bear Bryant here. Being one of their own, the Kentucky fans will allow Claiborne to build slowly. His 20-year record as a head coach is impressive, so all in all, it looks like Kentucky football is about to start rewarding those faithful fans that pack Commonwealth Stadium year after year through thick and through thin. Stop number 8 on the SEC Skyriders Tour, Phil Snow reporting from Lexington, Kentucky.
Attorneys for two state liquor store employees and the State Employees Association believe the layoff order is invalid because Alcoholic Beverage Control Board Administrator Joe Broadwater is holding two state jobs. They also say the layoff isn't in good faith. State Personnel Department officials testified that the ABC action meets the proper requirements and that no affected employees have officially requested a review of the layoffs. Deputy ABC Board Administrator Jenny Lazenby says they have some stores that can provide the same service with fewer employees or with part-time employees. According to her figures, the reduction in workers will save the state more than $5,000 a day. Judge Hooper says because no liquor store employees will be terminated until September 30th, he'll take the request for an injunction under advisement. Judge Hooper also asked attorneys for both sides to file written briefs in the case within 10 days. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
In public life shows his lack of qualification. On the other hand, his two opponents, the incumbent Associate Justice Oscar Adams of Birmingham and Joe Hill, a Supreme Court judge for all of the people and not just for the big-time lawyers, mixed up with those folks. The gentleman has stated falsely that I failed to appear in court in Coosa County when I was subpoenaed to stand for misdemeanor charges. I went to Rockford, the county seat of Coosa County, to pay the ticket.
Various crimes that we hadn't served on him yet. Charges, so he should be considered armed and dangerous. We'd like for anybody that knows his whereabouts to contact.
I thought Sheriff Butler was a Democrat. Didn't he? You know what?
You think when women get the leg, you might lose a leg, but still you might survive. Those two did.
Again, the 3-2 pitch to Horner, line drive, left center field. That's in for a base hit. Ramirez around third. Here comes Matthews' throw. It'll be caught by Mike Schmidt.
Horner's 86th RBI of the year. At the end of 4, Atlanta led it 1-0. In the 6th, they added 3 more. Jerry Royster on second. Claudell Washington delivers this RBI double down the line in left.
Royster
scores 2-0
at second with a double.
And out later, Horner delivers another run-scoring hit. This one also down the line.
The 87 RBIs. Washington will trot home. Horner rounds first base on his way to second.
Braves after 6. Top of the 7th, Washington on third. Dale Murphy with a medium fly ball to center. Gary Maddox with a good arm, but the throw is up the line. Washington scores easily, 4-0 Braves. That's all they needed. Rick Camp and Gene Garber
should be the ball game. Dale Murphy draws a bead, and the Braves have won 3 out of 4 from the Phillies.
Mr. Folsom's campaign is based on a principle he says George Washington wrote, which he first heard back in 1927. It goes, 1 man, 1 office is liberty. 1 man, 2 offices is a dictatorship. It's from that platform that Mr. Folsom strongly opposes the presence of lawyers in the state legislature. He says their involvement in law puts them in the judicial branch of government. If elected, he says he'll work to get the attorneys out of the legislature. Mr. Folsom was born in Elba. He's 74 years old and the father of 9 children. 2 of his sons are also seeking election to state offices this year. This is the 9th time Big Jim has sought the governor's chair. That's a record. The first time was in 1942. He lost then, but came back to win a runoff in 1946. After sitting out a term, he won a landslide victory in 1954. The Folsom administrations were well known for the programs to bring farm produce to the markets by paving many dirt roads in the state. Mr. Folsom has sought the governor's office 6 times since he left it. This time, he hopes once again to claim the office he left in the early 60s. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
Campaign. I think I personally would be embarrassed if the mayor denied something I was telling all over town and paying for ads. Yes, sir. It gave me 25% of the capitalization just to live here and make a living after this election is over, and that a man's credibility is normally his most precious possession. Businesses that were interested in financing equipment purchases, not to doubt that. Mr. Peak and one other hired employee were the only ones working in the company.
Recently, I have been receiving numerous telephone calls from people who will not identify themselves. Apparently they don't have the courage to do so. They only claim. I want to state publicly that I do not intend to retract the ads. The sledgehammer that I've used in the commercials is in no way meant to infer anyone should go around actually busting a power meter. The commercials say that on TV. However, I want people to know that I'm not about to back off on the utility issue, even though the callers infer that they have the ability to defeat me at the polls. I just don't believe that Alabama Power Company controls the people of District 81. 7th, cast a vote for Joe Dawkins and let the power company know that they don't run everything.
Or to keep you from being elected?
Despite their claims, I don't believe Alabama Power Company controls the people of District.
Certain that
Mr. Dixon told reporters that his opponent's ads, which say Dixon profited by owning part of a company that leased school buses, are misstatements of fact. Dixon says he only invested $500 in the company and lost that. He says the company hasn't made any money in 2 years. Mr. Dixon also charges the Alabama Education Association with helping his opponent print and distribute what he calls outright falsehoods.
But as I said, it is my understanding that AEA's polls show us with a substantial lead and that Paul Hubbard has personally taken over my opponent's campaign.
No, that's not true. Of course, Mr. Dixon has leveled a lot of charges here lately. He's talking about AEA a great deal, and of course, he's not talking much about the organization that's running his campaign, the Medical Association, of which he's a paid employee, as I understand it.
There are professional office staff working at the AEA who were there before Paul Hubbard and Joe Reed began running the association. They're highly upset about the way this campaign is being run. They are speaking to their friends, and their friends are speaking to me.
I suspect that I know who those 2 people were, and both of them left under circumstances where they weren't doing their job, and I'm sure they're using this as a way to try to get back at the association.
Mr. Dixon says his opponent is using smear tactics because the polls show him as the leader. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
I was selling all over town and paying for ads.
These will all be in your machines. Are there any questions at this point? If not, we'll proceed. The seal number matches the number on the envelope. You will open the machine, check all your counters to be sure that they are at 0. You will
Representative Holmes says the spots are running only on black radio stations, not those with primarily white listeners. He says the advertisements urge blacks to ignore their leaders and vote for Wallace in Tuesday's primary.
Weeks of the Alabama governor's race, several special interest groups, including the so-called leadership of the ADC and some rich Republicans, are trying to dictate how you should vote. But the people of Alabama know that when George Wallace was governor, there were more jobs and better educational opportunities for both black and white Alabamians than ever before. A vote for Wallace is a vote against special interest groups and a vote for the average working Alabamian.
I don't like the idea, and I resent the fact that he has made such vicious attacks toward black people in this state because we didn't endorse him for governor. And as a result, I have sent a telegram, and I have asked Governor Wallace to apologize to the black people in the state of Alabama.
Wallace aide Elvin Stanton says he hasn't received any communication from Holmes and has no comment. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
To Richard Green, we express our sincere gratitude and appreciation for the contribution you have made to the perinatal outreach education program. Your generous gifts of time and expertise have contributed greatly to the skills of the personnel who care for mothers and babies in Region 5 of the state of Alabama. And this is from the Regional Perinatal Advisory Committee of Region 5. Dr. Green, appreciate it. Thank you, John.
The September 7 primary. We'll reevaluate after the primary. We've endorsed Mr. Joe McCorkadale, that we feel is the best candidate that's Secretary of State, Betty Frank. Betty's just he stood with us that the government puts no money in our schools, our academics is superior, and that he said, all right, the state should play no part in controlling your curriculum, your teachers, or your program. He stood with us in that issue. He stood with us on the ERA, that we were in opposition to that, and of course a number of the other moral issues, and we just
District Attorney and the sheriff's officer called out the scene and they can we're still not approved ours. Rape covers sexual intercourse with a female under the age of 16. A subject broke from behind the store and ran towards Officer Kidd's position. He identified himself as a police officer. Asked the subject to halt. The subject did not. Officer Kidd fired one shot from a shotgun. The subject continued to run through the woods. At this point, he fired again, and the subject went down.
Steve Sloan begins his 5th season here at Ole Miss with storm clouds very clearly on the horizon.
Go down to the truck and get me a pair of those
come on back.
White air wings.
See that ball is airborne.
That means that Steve and his team will have 2 opponents this year, a tough schedule and a negative press. It will be very difficult to overcome both. There is a chance, however. The Rebels return starters at almost every position except quarterback. John Fourcade is gone, some say for the good. He was brilliant at times, just as mediocre at other times. There is a body of thought that believes it's difficult, if not impossible, to recruit black athletes in a school with a mascot named Colonel Rebel and a crowd that waves a rebel flag. That could very well explain why one of the brightest young coaches in America is very close to losing his job. Stop number 9 on the SEC Skywriters Tour. This is Phil Snow reporting from Oxford, Mississippi.
and discuss issues with me. For those calls, I am very thankful, and I appreciate those callers. That the people in my district were well represented. I think I am the most qualified and the most...
Cases against the power company or just what?
In fact, one of the biggest rate increases that's ever been blocked. $210 million increase that was granted Alabama Power Company by the PSC in this state went to circuit court here in Montgomery and ultimately to the Supreme Court and entirely blocked the whole rate increase.
Mr. Dixon says he's concerned that the truth will play no part in his opponent's plans for the final days of the campaign. Mr. Dixon says recent radio and newspaper ads about him completely misstate the facts about his actions in the legislature and in his private life. Mr. Dixon says the AEA is helping to print and distribute campaign material for Barry Teague.
Have you printed material for Mr. Teague in particular?
I believe that I saw some recently printed, yes. But again, that's nothing violating the law and nothing unusual about that.
Mr. Dixon speculates there's a reason for what his opponent is doing.
We're ahead. You don't attack someone if he's behind. Have you ever heard of a candidate who was leading, turning on the loser and attacking him?
Well, I think you can tell who's desperate by the way they're calling press conferences. Obviously, Mr. Dixon knows he's trailing, or he wouldn't be making these kind of grandiose charges. And the polls I've seen indicate Mr. Teague is going to be elected.
Hubbard denies he's running Mr. Teague's campaign. Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
Really blew up on me.
In the closing weeks of the Alabama governor's race, several special interest groups, including the so-called leadership of the ADC and some rich Republicans, are trying to dictate how you should vote. But the people of Alabama know that when George Wallace was governor, there were more jobs and better educational opportunities for both black and white Alabamians than ever before.
Representative Alvin Holmes says these ads are vicious and racist, and he's demanding that the former governor take them off the air. Holmes says Wallace is running these ads aimed at black leaders of the Alabama Democratic Conference because the ADC endorsed George McMillan. Holmes says this is the same kind of tactic the former governor used when he ran against Albert Brewer in 1970.
Governor Wallace has a long history. When he can't get his way, then he starts to attack people.
You think that's what he's doing because he didn't get the endorsement?
Yes, he acting like a little child because he didn't get the endorsement. He's going to embark upon a journey of attacking black leaders in this state.
Wallace aide Elvin Stanton says he hasn't heard from Holmes and has no comment. Gina Gregory, WSFA TV News.
What people do as relates to that.
January 5th, Traction Avenue. Easter Sunday, Holcomb Street. June 12th, Cloverland Drugs. And August 8th, Mulberry Street were just 4 of the 8 times so far this year Montgomery police have been involved in shootings or shootouts with suspects. Out of the 8 incidents, 7 suspects were shot. 1 police officer was killed and another was wounded. Authorities say police-involved shootings have at least doubled from last year. The latest incident took place this morning when police were called to the Auto Parts Service Company on West Fairview to report by a citizen of a burglary in progress. Lieutenant E.E. Wright says instead of finding a burglary, officers L.G. Kidd and J.W. Clark walked up on 2 men behind the parts store who were allegedly raping a 15-year-old girl.
When they got there, a subject broke from behind the store and ran towards Officer Kidd's position. He identified himself as a police officer, asked the subject to halt. The subject did not. Officer Kidd fired 1 shot from a shotgun. The subject continued to run through the woods. At this point, he fired again, and the subject went down.
The subject shot was Darrell Wayne Pruitt of Montgomery. Police are also looking for a 20-year-old man in connection with the incident. Both suspects have been charged with second-degree rape. Chief of Detectives for the Police Department, Major E.B. Alford, believes the increase in officer-involved shootings stems from an officer arriving on the scene while crimes are being committed. While the number of suspects shot has increased, so has the number of times police officers have been fired on or assaulted.
Even in arrest situations on misdemeanors, we're having more officers assaulted on a daily basis. And I think it's just the attitude of the people now, and this is the trend, is to stay out of jail and do what you got to do to stay out.
The district attorney's office and the sheriff's office are conducting a routine investigation of the shooting. Police have been cleared of any wrongdoing in all the other shootings. Don Phelps, WSFA TV News. The shooting and the alleged rape took place in back of the Auto Parts Service Company on Fairview Avenue. Police received a call from a citizen about a burglary in progress. When police officers L.G. Kidd and J.W. Clark arrived on the scene, Officer Kidd circled in back of the building. Lieutenant E.E. Wright says just moments later, a suspect fled from the crime scene toward Officer Kidd.
He identified himself as a police officer, asked the subject to halt. The subject did not. Officer Kidd fired one shot from a shotgun. The subject continued to run through the woods. At this point, he fired again, and the subject went down. After investigation, we found that there had been no attempted burglary on the business, but there was a rape in progress of a 15-year-old female by two males.
The suspect, 18-year-old Darrell Wayne Pruitt of Montgomery, was wounded in the shoulder and lower back. Police are also looking for a 20-year-old man in connection with the alleged sexual assault on a 15-year-old girl. Pruitt has been charged with second-degree rape. The shooting is under investigation by the Montgomery Sheriff's Department as well as the District Attorney's Office. Anytime a police officer is involved in the shooting, the two outside departments are called in to investigate. Don Phelps, WSFA TV News.
The Braves got their second consecutive outstanding starting performance. Rick Camp holding the Phillies in check for 7 innings. Leading 1-0 in the 6th, Claudell Washington jumps on his first pitch. He goes the opposite way to drive home Jerry Royster. Bob Horner, who singled in the Braves' first run in the 4th, drives the ball to left on the first pitch delivered to him, and Washington trots home. Horner's double gives him 87 RBIs on the year. Philadelphia handed the Braves a gift run in the 8th inning, prompted by their third error. Gene Garber took over for Camp in the 8th inning with 2 runners on and no outs. The Braves' 155th double play erased that threat. Braves 4, Philadelphia nothing.
Birmingham Stallions of the United States Football League, Coach Riley Dodge.
Just like I wrote it, and I appreciate it. Members of the media, our office staff, it's a long way. You can rest assured that we will try to secure every qualified athlete within the state of Alabama and in the South. We know that this is going to be, by and large, our lifeblood. Our territorial schools are going to provide the bulk of these players, but we don't want to miss any capable athlete within the state or within the surrounding areas.
LSU is a team in turmoil. Few teams have had more shockwaves move through than have the Bengal Tigers in the last couple of years. You remember Bo Ryan's tragic death and then Jerry Stovall's sudden move into the head coaching job. The surprisingly good season his first year, then the surprisingly bad year last year in '81, including the most damaging shockwave of all, that 48-7 season-ending loss to Tulane, the in-state rival. Another trauma came with the disclosure of financial problems in the athletic department. Paul Dietzel, the athletic director, resigned after being stripped of his authority. So Jerry Stovall must try to keep his football team on an even keel through some very tough times here in Bengal land. Winning games may be the only tonic, but with all the contenders except Georgia on the schedule, that won't be easy. Then there's the problem with Tulane. Another loss would be intolerable to once proud Tiger fans. Stovall's contract runs through the '84 season, but there are many Tiger fans who are convinced he won't be around that long. This is stop number 10 on the SEC Skywriters Tour. Phil Snow reporting from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
It'll be a new experience for me starting for Auburn, and may probably be a pretty new experience just playing. I didn't play a whole lot last year, but I'm really looking forward to next week.
How would you describe the running these last few days of the freshman right halfback, Bo Jackson?
Pretty good. I just hope he keeps it up during the season. He's got excellent speed, and he's big and strong, and he's going to help us a whole lot. He really is.
Joe McCorkadale comes from the small southwest Alabama community of Jackson, and most of the people of Jackson apparently would love nothing more than to have their hometown son become the next governor. This isn't the first time they've supported him. For the last 24 years, Joe McCorkadale has been serving as the Clark County member in the House of Representatives. For the last 8 years, he's been elected by the other House members to serve as the Speaker of the House. That's a fact that prides Mr. McCorkadale, since it's the first time in the state's history anyone has been elected to serve consecutive terms as the presiding officer of the House. The Speaker says he also feels his 24 years of experience are an important asset to any governor. But becoming governor isn't easy for Mr. McCorkadale. He's been fighting name recognition problems in the northern part of the state. Some political hopefuls say he has done so successfully. What recognition he might have up there is expected to be among the business community. Mr. McCorkadale was recently rated by the State Chamber of Commerce as having voted correctly 89% of the time on selected business issues. But the Speaker also apparently has broad-based support, reflected in several polls which show him running very high, and in at least one poll, a projection that the Speaker could win the Democratic nomination, possibly without a runoff. Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News.
He stood with us that the government puts no money in our schools, our academics is superior, and that he said, all right, the state should play no part in controlling your curriculum, your teachers, or your program. He stood with us in that issue. He stood with us on the ERA, that we were in opposition to that. We'll reevaluate after the primary. We've endorsed Mr. Joe McCorkadale, that we feel is the best candidate that's Secretary of State, Betty Frank. Betty's just he stood with us that the government puts no money in our schools, our academics is superior, and that he said, all right, the state should play no part in controlling your curriculum, your teachers, or your program.
If someone were, say, charged or under one of these laws, one of these acts, they could certainly go into court and challenge it exactly 5 p.m.
When we stumped the state for the act a year ago, the people reacted very vigorously and positively for it. I think every newspaper in the state endorsed it. And now to deny the people the right to vote on this amendment, to me is unthinkable.
My contributions have come. In 1978, Mr. Harrison told the people in this area that he opposed special interest. But at the same time, he took more than $15,000 from the same special interest groups. That was hypocritical. But this time, he's gone even further. Despite his vicious attacks against AEA in 1978, he has, in this election, already taken $5,000 from the Alabama Education Association. You can flip through and
get down to the last few days, is clearly a desperate man, liable to say almost anything that detracts from the real issues of this campaign. A small field office to facilitate this intervention as well as to provide, I think, many of the other business practices of the Alabama Power Company in some of the expenses that they incur are not being effectively regulated. There are serious allegations that come to me almost daily from people in every sector of life in this state, small business people, just individual consumers, people at the Chamber of Commerce in small towns and big towns across the state, about how the Alabama Power Company does business. And I just feel very strongly that they are not being effectively regulated and are out of control in this state.
Like a maximum security jail cell, there's only one way in and one way out of the voting machine. Once the curtain closes, you have to vote or you don't get out. But while inside, the 4 poll workers on the outside won't know how you voted unless you're the only one to vote or if everyone casts his ballot the same way. But despite the complete privacy, some people still believe their votes can be revealed.
In some cases, people feel like when you mark the poll list and you sign your name, there's a number next to your name. The people feel like the machine will record in order how the votes were cast. This is not the case. You have counters on the voting machine that record the votes, but it's a random recording. It records as the votes are cast, but it does not show that this was the first vote cast on the machine or the 10th vote or the 100th vote. It just totals the votes as they are cast.
Also, the machines by their design prevent voter fraud. As one county official put it, it would take a monumental conspiracy to tamper with the voting machine. The official says the best way to rig the machine is not to. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
It's the 4th governor's race in his 30-year political career in Alabama for George Wallace. This one is different because the race issue is absent and a significant number of blacks publicly support him this time. Wallace has come from avowed racist to openly seeking support from the Black Alabama Democratic Conference. He's attracted larger crowds to his rallies than any other candidate in the governor's race, and from the start was predicted to be in the runoff if there is one. The old Wallace magic is back, with the barbecues, the familiar colors, and that well-organized, synchronized staff that's been the hallmark of his personal appearances. The 63-year-old Mr. Wallace says he's the only candidate in the race with the experience to get the state's high unemployment down and to attract new industry to Alabama. Wallace also says his health is not a factor in the race because his physicians have said that he's physically fit to run for the governor's office. Despite criticism from most of the state's major newspapers, Mr. Wallace is still full steam ahead, and many expect political history to repeat itself with the former governor winning the Democratic primary. This is Norman Lumpkin, WSFA TV News reporting.
If George McMillan looks like an underdog in the Democratic primary, that's okay with the candidate's wife. Ann McMillan says her husband was not favored to win his earlier political races, but he always won anyway. In 1973, McMillan was a political unknown when he defeated 8 opponents without a runoff for a seat in the State House of Representatives. He went on to serve a full term as state senator and then defeat 11 opponents to become lieutenant governor. McMillan's speeches are frequently littered with subtle and not-so-subtle references to one of his opponents, George Wallace. To McMillan, Alabama has suffered from years of shallow political rhetoric. He says it's a state distracted by politicians more interested in grabbing national headlines than in developing natural resources. McMillan says he shuns old-fashioned demagoguery and favors common-sense solutions. His plans to get the economy moving include revamping the State Development Office and sprucing up the state's image for industrial prospects. Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
The 120 staff people, the lawyers, the auditors, the expert. My opponent, as we get down to the last few days, is clearly a desperate man, liable to say almost anything that detracts from the real issues of this campaign. My work in the Alabama Coalition Against Hunger has oftentimes been in the public spotlight. I think I represent to the voters of this state a very clear alternative for someone who will provide effective regulation of the utilities in this state. My educational background with a master's degree in social work administration from the University of Alabama is there for people to see. I feel that I present the best opportunity for the people of this state to have effective regulation. I think I've clearly addressed the issues, and I think these issues are the issues of this campaign. Of course, I have no control over what anyone else chooses to make an issue.
But you can look through that and just flip. Despite his vicious attacks against AEA in 1978, he has, in this election, already taken $5,000 from the Alabama Education Association. That was as of Tuesday now, no telling how much he's taken since then. This is quite a switch in Mr. Harrison's philosophy, I'd say. The people voted for a man who said one thing but has done entirely the opposite. In addition to AEA, Mr. Harrison, in this election, received $5,000 from the Trial Lawyers Association. He's also taken $2,000 from the various judges around the state. Remember, this same senator handed the state judges a 34% pay raise in the last regular session of the Alabama legislature.
History and politics remains a mystery, but any individual who would characterize the Reconstruction period following the Civil War as the best period in Alabama political history is sadly out of touch with the average law. My opponent bases his campaign on a promise to raise the price industry pays for electricity. At the same time, industry is laying off hundreds of workers a day. Such policy would result in thousands of Alabamians losing their jobs. Laying off hundreds of workers a day. Such policy would result in thousands of Alabamians losing their jobs.
This is the start of a season Hornet coach George James has been looking very much forward to. Last year, Bama State was 5-4-1, and James says this year's team is much better. Andy says they can't wait to take on Jackson State, a perennial power, currently ranked number 2 in the NCAA Division I AA.
Oh, well, the players just dying to get to Jackson, and I'm pleased to know that they are ready, because I believe they are ready. We're young, but we say they got some hitters, and we're going to fool a lot of folks, I think, this year.
What's been the most impressive part of fall practice so far?
Our freshmen. We playing a lot of freshmen for the first time since I've been here, and they are really super to me. And the attitude of the players who they want to win, and we're trying to do a good job of teaching, and I think we're going to have a chance.
Much of the Hornets' fortunes will ride on the shoulders of sophomore quarterback Eddie Shy. But James says several freshmen are pushing Shy for the starting job, something Shy says he welcomes.
Yes, I got a couple of quarterbacks here giving me a little competition, and that's what I need, someone to really push me to make me better. But I think I'm going to be able to hold on to it because I'm going to keep working hard as I can, to maintain that starting position.
What about Jackson State this Saturday night? Always a tough team. They're bound to be good this year, too.
Yeah, Jackson is good. They got a pretty good defense coming back. We've been working hard on, reading the defensive coverages and linebackers and stuff. But I think we're going to be ready for them.
Alabama State and Jackson State kick it off 7:30 tomorrow night at Crampton Bowl. Rick Pons, WSFA TV Sports.
Go and played around and kept appointing unqualified people there and finally got ready and abolished it. About the time they got a good man there, they abolished it. And now about election time, they want to put it back. The advertisement I heard on TV this morning was nothing more than just misleading rhetoric. People of Alabama know from looking at their power bills that they're not being treated fairly. They don't have to have somebody throwing a bunch of numbers at them. And I think the people deserve to know that Alabama Power is not, relatively speaking to the other companies, not doing as well as the commissioners are saying they're doing.
Voting machines are designed to prevent voter fraud. Unless they pass inspection, the machines aren't used in the election. But officials say even if you wanted to rig the machine, you can't, because to tamper with it would be too obvious.
Anything that's done in the back of the machine will show up on the front of the machine on election day. Anything that you do in the back to lock out a voter or allow people to vote for more than one candidate would become very obvious, as we discussed, when you try to vote. If you lock out a person, then when you come in and you try to turn the lever, it won't turn. If you try to make it where you could vote for two people in one race, then again it's going to be very obvious.
Once inside the machine, the ballot should be completely cleared. If not, voters should tell the poll workers. Also, once the curtain is closed, you can't open it unless you vote. And you can only vote for one candidate in each race. If two levers can be pulled for candidates in the same race, voters should again alert the poll workers. But that's not likely to happen. Officials say there's no foolproof way to tamper with the voting machine. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Ministries legislation that has been passed who's directly linked to the background with Barry in terms of voting. He has our endorsements on, first of all, the response to our questionnaire. It was a rather lengthy and thorough questionnaire, 4 pages, 8.5 by 14, and it dealt with a number of areas. First of all, their own personal faith, basically pretty much 50-50 position in some of the areas, though that in and of itself would not necessarily prevent endorsement if they were the best candidate in all other respects. Second area on the questionnaire dealt with, for example, their overall political philosophy, conservative, liberal, middle of the road.
Until after a jury verdict in excess of $1 million has thrown out his complaint.
Is there a motion? Is not in the hands of my political opponent. The matter is now in the hands of the courts.
This is no effort to delay getting a deadline.
There's about 6 different appearances that both of us appeared on the platform in public and had an opportunity to speak from 3 to 6 minutes.
This month's edition of the ASEA News contains an article about the state liquor store employee layoff. In that article, ASEA Executive Director Paul Smith is quoted as saying the employee reduction is designed to cripple the state liquor business, and that if the state gets out of the liquor business, consumers will be paying more. A spokesman for private liquor stores in Alabama, Jim Cunningham, disagrees.
Mr. Cunningham, what would happen to the price of liquor in a private store if the state got completely out of the liquor business?
Well, it would be lower than the private stores are charging now, and I feel based on the volume, it could probably even be lower than what the state is selling it for today.
According to Mr. Cunningham, private package stores have actually helped the state increase tax revenues from liquor sales.
Will this move help private package stores laying off employees?
No, not really, because the stores are still going to be open. It won't have any effect on the private liquor stores. As you know, there is one private store located right across the street from the state store here in Montgomery, and if they lay off 2 or 3 employees at that store across the street, it won't have any effect on the private store across the street. They'll still be open the same hours. They'll still have the products. It won't affect them.
Dennis Latham, WSFA TV News.
The state airplane cranked up early this morning, taking Governor James to a series of news conferences in Mobile, Montgomery, Birmingham, and then Huntsville. The governor made the statewide sweep to put in one last good word about the constitutional provision that he says will keep the state's general fund and education budgets from submarining during a regular session into a pile of legislation and surfacing only on the last night for whirlwind passage. The governor says he still feels right is on his side when it comes to the controversy of whether the proposed amendment should appear on the ballot now instead of 1984. The governor's legal advisor says his office has been successful in getting the amendment on the ballot across the state.
The printers that control the great majority of the ballots, or print the great majority of the ballots in the state, have it on their ballots. So it will take an action by the election official of the county, which is the probate judge, to block it out.
But I think that people want discipline in their budgetary process. I think they want to know exactly how the money is spent, who's making what, and this would make that a reality, in my opinion. And to wait 2 years to do what's obviously right and what the people obviously want, to me is a mistake.
Right or wrong, the amendment is expected to show up on the ballot statewide Tuesday when the voters go to the polls. Governor James was asked who he might vote for. He only responded, "I'll definitely vote yes on Amendment number 1, the isolation provision." Chris Grimshaw, WSFA TV News at the State Hangar.
It's called by some the eyes and ears of the state troopers.
Hamburg, East 1084. Okay, give him over.
And this weekend, the Trooper Radio Dispatch Station in North Montgomery will handle thousands of calls. Corporal Gene Gravely of the Alabama State Troopers says the office is responsible for 2 other radio posts as well as trooper activity in 6 counties.
They also have communication with the different other agencies, such as the sheriff's departments, the city police departments, and other state agencies.
The dispatchers work long, hard hours on the holiday weekends, taking reports of accidents from the telephone, radio, and emergency motorist aid call boxes, as well as supplying troopers with information. They're also given, on some occasions, the unpleasant task of calling people to tell them family members have been injured in an accident. The dispatchers never telephone news of a death. Troopers must tell family members that news in person. It's a job they don't like.
It's just unreal the way you feel, and especially when you have to go to a person's home and tell someone, say, your loved one's not coming back. Your husband and your wife, your brother, your sister, your son or your daughter, they won't be coming home because they're dead. That's the most difficult part about this job.
But it's also a job they expect to do at least 25 times before the weekend is over. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
Lambert Bennett is harvesting corn this week. Next week he'll start pulling up the peanuts. 57-year-old Greenville man has been farming all his life. Bennett bought his land about 30 years ago in a time of easy and cheap credit. In 1975, he paid off his Farmers Home Administration loan. That same year, he reluctantly took out a second mortgage, and he says he's had to borrow a little more each year to stay afloat.
I think if I have a bad year this year, that's going to about wind me up. 3 years in a row just about get you. And if something don't happen where we have a pretty fair crop this year and get a pretty good price for it, why, I don't know where I'll be able to go another year or not.
In general, it's a hard time for all farmers, but Bennett's kind are fast disappearing. He is one of only 55,000 black farmers in this country. There are more than 3 million white farmers. From 1970 to 1980, while the white farm population declined by 22%, the black farm population declined by 65%. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission fears that if the trend is not reversed, there will be fewer than 10,000 black farmers by the end of the next decade. Bennett says if he and other black farmers have a chance of sticking it out, it will be because they're used to struggling.
We are used to hardship. It doesn't bother us too much. Tough time doesn't bother us so much. But you know, there's only so much you can stand, you know.
Bennett has always wanted to leave his farm to his 25-year-old son. Now he's not so sure he can.
I hope I make it through this year. And I'm going to struggle hard and try to make it through this year. Do all I can to make it, but that's all I can do, you know.
Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
The days grow shorter, but the World's Fair here in Knoxville goes on. There's the feeling among most here that the fair has been a success. Already 7.5 million people have come through the gates. It was generally felt that 9 million would be a break-even point. That 11 million goal is not totally out of the question with 2 months to go. If you want one man's opinion, I'd strongly suggest the exhibits of the ancient cultures, China, Peru, and Egypt. Some of the live entertainment is good too, particularly if you're a country music fan. One more suggestion, don't overdo it. You'll be walking and standing most of the time. That's hard on people who aren't accustomed to it. Tennessee will have 4 football Saturdays during the fair. Traffic problems during that time will be severe. If you're coming to the Alabama-Tennessee game on October 16th and you're willing to endure the crowds, you can make it a doubleheader, but the traffic problems will be bad. Perhaps the best idea would be to come early in the week. The crowds are much smaller, the weather should be progressively cooler, and the waiting in line much shorter. Reporting from the Knoxville World's Fair on the SEC Skyriders Tour, this is Phil Snow.
Larry Lee has spent most of his campaign time talking to the people, especially the farmers. Lee says they've been telling him it's tough making a living these days, and that message isn't getting through to their representatives in Washington. That concerns Lee, a former editor of a farming magazine. He says he may not have all the answers to the farmers' problems, but he knows what economic hardships they face, and he wants to help. But it's not just the farmers Lee says he wants to help, it's all the people in the district, and Lee says his blueprint for progress is designed to do just that. Lee calls his plan a catalyst for action. It includes taking an inventory of the resources in Alabama, then making use of those resources. For example, Lee says he'd look at alternative crops and decide how to best market them. Lee believes the agricultural economy is the key issue in the race, along with military needs. But he says unless we can get farmers back on their feet, we'll all be in a real bind. Kim Davis, WSFA TV News.
Billy Joe Camp is a native of Coleman County and is no newcomer to Alabama politics. He served on his county board of education after receiving his BS degree in business administration from the University of North Alabama. Mr. Camp was press secretary to former Governor George Wallace from 1971 to 1979 and was elected president of the Alabama Public Service Commission in 1980. Mr. Camp originally had his eyes on the lieutenant governor's chair for this election, but decided to switch to the congressional race after former Attorney General Bill Baxley announced he would run for lieutenant governor. Mr. Camp says he made the change for several reasons, but mostly to bring the Democratic Party together. Mr. Camp says he served the people well as president of the PSC by not approving a single rate increase requested by the big utilities because he says they did not deserve them. He says when he's elected to the 2nd District congressional seat, there are several areas he will concentrate his efforts to help the people of the district. 2 of the most important, he says, is to bring about lower interest rates for Alabamians. He says in traveling around the district in these last few days before the primary, more people are concerned about the economic situation in the country, and says he will work to bring more jobs to the state and economic recovery. Mr. Camp says it's important to see a balanced budget in Congress, but to bring this about will require a lower interest rate so industries can expand and create more jobs. He also says he's concerned about low prices being paid to the farming community for their products and says the government is going to have to give farmers assistance in developing overseas markets for products. Mr. Camp has received endorsements from several organizations in the past week and says he's confident of a victory in the Democratic primary. Matt Carmack, WSFA TV News.
The national deficit. So, those
1-2 pitch.
In the top of the second, it's the Yankees that jump out on top. Lou Piniella unloads on Larry Gura for this long home run to left, his 5th of the year. Piniella goes 4 for 4 on the day. 1-0 Yanks, and it stayed that way until the Royals' 7th. 2 outs and John Wathan on second. Jerry Martin hits a blooper to center off Shane Raleigh. It's in for a single. Wathan scores to tie the game at 1. Yanks get that back in the 8th. Rick Cerrone rips a double down the line in left. That allows Roy Smalley to score from second. New York now leads it 2-1. KC tied it in the bottom of the 8th, and the Yanks get the game winner in the 9th. Dave Winfield makes no doubt about it. A long solo homer to left, his 27th of the year, and the Yankees beat the Royals the final 3-2.
They started at midnight, lighting the fires, mixing the sauce, preparing more than 1.5 tons of meat for the annual Greek community barbecue at the Greek Orthodox Church.
Well, it started 34 years ago as a project, a main charitable project of our community to help support the church and the many charities that we're also interested in, and has grown and blossomed over the years into a very major traditional affair in the city of Montgomery.
There are about 150 Greek families in Montgomery. Nearly all take part in the barbecue. That means plenty of advice. And an equal number of quality tests. Douglas Camusi Sr. has been helping with the barbecue since it started.
I have a secret basting sauce, which I have had for a number of years. I don't pass it out to no one. I keep it to myself. My son knows it, my oldest son knows it, my youngest son knows it. If anything ever happens to me, it'd be passed on through them. I don't give that out. That's something that I keep sacred.
But there's also camp stew. 800 gallons of it. By the time the barbecue and stew go on sale tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, there will also be thousands of homemade Greek pastries. It is obviously a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun. And it just may be enough to feed the 10,000 people who are expected to show up to buy it all. Tom Foreman, WSFA TV News.
If you are white and male, your chances of being murdered in this country are 1 in 164. But if you are black and male, the probability increases to 1 in 28. The truth is, blacks are more likely to become victims of crime, especially at the hands of black neighbors and relatives. The same is true for the city of Montgomery.
In 1981, we had 30 homicides. 57% were committed black on black. In 1982, up through August 31st, we've had 17 homicides. 14 were black on black, or 82% of all of them committed.
Major Alford says a police officer can be a deterrent to crime by his very presence. But he says an officer isn't around when tempers flare over money, marriage, or for no apparent reason at all.
We had 2 guys up in one of the predominantly black areas in a housing project area. They were arguing over who was going to be the best man in a friend of theirs' wedding, and one shoots the other. 2 guys are arguing outside of a nightclub about one taking a drink out of the other one's beer, and one beats the other one to death with a jack handle.
Major Alford follows the statistics and is alarmed. The Community Relations Division of the Police Department holds street dances to develop trust with youngsters. Putting black officers to patrol black housing areas seems to make little difference, says Alford. They become just another uniform. But then Alford says he doesn't really know what causes black-on-black crime. He's too busy investigating the results.
I wish I knew the answer to that question on what causes black-on-black crimes. Again, it's going to take the people of those particular areas are going to have to realize that they do have a problem, that their own people are being killed and shot by each other. And they're going to stand up and organize themselves, just like they have in so many other causes, and stop black-on-black crime.
Susan Silvernail, WSFA TV News.
Mobil oil, I hope we take a strong disciplinary action to see that it never happens again, and they are in violation of some civil laws, and they need to be prosecuted on those civil laws. Where it's a criminal case or not.
Jackson State struck first after a scoreless first quarter. Halfback Otis Brown took with the point after Tigers led it 7-0, 13:05 remaining in the half. On the next series of downs, Alabama State drives it 84 yards for a score. 75 coming on this outstanding scamper by tailback Walter Shelley. After taking the handoff, Shelley breaks outside, shakes loose from numerous tackles, and rambles all the way down to the Jackson State 5, and the Hornets are in business. A couple of plays later, fullback Bruce Porterfield carries it over from the 1. With the point after, the game's all tied at 7. But right before the half, the Tigers mount a drive, this one for 62 yards. Quarterback Derek McCall finds tight end Cleo Simmons for a 23-yard scoring strike. The point after was good. 31 seconds left in the half, and Jackson State led it 14-7. The Tigers then put it away in the second half. They took the kickoff, drove it all the way down. McCall takes it in from the 2. And Jackson State led it 21-7. That's where it ended. Bama State attempts to regroup in Mobile next Saturday against Alcorn State. Jackson State travels to Nashville to meet Tennessee State. Montreal jumped on top of the second with their only hit of the day. It comes off Rick Mailer as Al Oliver leads off with this solo home run to right, his 20th round tripper of the year, and Steve Rogers makes the 1-0 lead hold until the 7th. That's when Claudell Washington gets it going for the Braves. He sends one to the gap in left center. Tim Raines can't make the play. Washington hesitates, then motors to third, and he's safe in a close play. Dale Murphy then follows with this single back up the middle. Washington scores Murph's 99th RBI of the year, and our game's tied at 1. Then it's trouble for the Braves in the 9th. Gene Garber pitching, Andre Dawson on third. 2 outs. Gary Carter bounces one sharply to Rafael Ramirez. He muffs it, recovers, and throws, but Carter's safe in a bang-bang play at first. The replay shows the closeness of the play. It could have gone either way. Dawson scored. Expos win it 2-1, despite a combined one-hitter by Rick Mailer and Gene Garber.
Stone is a Montgomery real estate man who up until 3 years ago had spent a quarter century in the automobile business. He spent 2 years in the Army at the end of World War II as a rifleman in the infantry. During the Korean conflict, Stone spent another 2 years in the Air Force as an officer. He's a graduate of the University of Alabama, where he majored in Commerce and Business Administration. He's been married to his wife Lucy for 30 years. They have 3 children. Stone says he's a candidate because the U.S. economy is in deep trouble. Stone says in the past he left his concerns with the country's problems to other politicians. But now he's taking his degree in business administration, business mathematics, and business economy to Washington to do what he can